When we talk about facing a massive challenge or pushing back against some huge obstacle in your life, the language we culturally default to is all about posture.
Yeah, specifically an aggressive posture, right? Like standing tall or holding the line.
Exactly. We are constantly told to just brace ourselves, dig our heels in, and fight back.
It's basically the language of leverage.
Yeah.
You fortify your position, you dig deep into your own reserves, and you rely entirely on your own strength to just weather the storm.
Right, which makes total sense to us. But I want to welcome you to today's deep dive because the source material we're unpacking today takes that entire cultural assumption and, well, it turns it completely upside down.
It really does. It's a total paradigm shift.
Today, our mission is to explore this really profound and honestly incredibly counterintuitive concept found in a sermon by Brother Armstrong. We're looking tightly at a specific passage in the Epistle of James, chapter 4, verses 6 and 7.
Yeah, and the bold premise that Brother Armstrong is tackling in this sermon is fascinating. He frames it as an absolute foundational truth for his listeners.
Which is this idea that humiliation, or literally bowing down in front of God, is the singular mechanism that allows a person to stand strong against everything else.
It's just a wild paradox to try and unpack. I mean, the underlying argument here is that the way up is actually down.
Right.
And what's fascinating here is understanding who James is actually addressing in the original text. People often assume that these stark, heavy warnings in ancient texts are directed at the bad guys out there, the unredeemed world.
Right, the outsiders.
Exactly. But according to the notes, James is writing directly to believers. He's addressing people inside the fold who are actively struggling. I mean, they are tangled up in their own selfish desires, battling worldliness, and suffering from a serious case of spiritual pride.
So they aren't these pristine, perfect examples of faith at all.
Oh, not even close. Highly messy. The community was totally fractured. But despite all of these deeply human failings, the text introduces this almost shocking promise. It doesn't start by dropping a hammer of condemnation on them. It actually starts with an intervention of grace.
Okay, let's unpack this intervention. Because to really understand Armstrong's framework for how a person can stand strong, we first have to examine the primary resource the text says we've been given to fight with, which is, that grace.
Right, it's the foundational tool.
Yeah, and James 4.6 starts with this phrase, but he gives more grace. And when I was reading through the notes trying to visualize this, the common metaphors we use just felt, a bit too passive.
Like grace is just a warm blanket or something.
Exactly. Instead, I want you to think about a massive toxic chemical spill threatening to ruin an entire ecosystem.
Okay, I can picture that.
If our daily failures and selfish desires are that spreading toxic spill, Armstrong suggests that God's grace isn't just like a sandbag you use to try and contain the edges.
Right.
Grace is more like a specialized chemical dispersant that gets dropped directly onto the spill and fundamentally alters its molecular structure.
Oh, that's good.
It doesn't just cover the damage, right? It completely neutralizes the toxicity because the neutralizing agent is infinitely more powerful than the spill itself.
That mechanical view actually aligns perfectly with the whole Bible connections provided in the source material. Instead of looking at grace as just a passive cover, Brother Armstrong points specifically to Romans 5.20 to explain how this actually works.
What does that verse say?
It says, "Where sin increased, grace abounded all the more." The phrasing there is incredibly active. It implies a dynamic, aggressive response.
So it's not just a static supply sitting in some warehouse in heaven. It scales to meet the threat.
Yes, exactly. The Greek phrasing behind that concept actually suggests a superabundance. It's like pouring a literal gallon of water onto a single lit match.
Overkill, basically.
Total overkill. The scale of the grace is mathematically disproportionate to the scale of the failure. And the core argument in this sermon is that God's grace is never limited or exhausted by human failure. It doesn't just run dry because a person messes up for the 100th time.
That is incredibly reassuring.
It is, but the sermon immediately introduces a massive caveat, and this is what drives the entire tension of this deep dive. This superabundant supply of grace is only received through a very specific posture.
Right.
The resource is infinite, but the pipeline to access it has a valve, and that valve is humility.
Which raises the big question. If that endless neutralizing resource is always available, why is the toxic spill still ruining so many lives?
Exactly. Why aren't we all just living in total victory?
Right. Why do so many people feel dry and defeated and just overwhelmed most of the time?
Yeah.
Well, the text offers a really blunt explanation for what blocks that pipeline. The second half of James 4.6 quotes Proverbs 3.34, stating God opposes the proud.
Yeah, that's a tough one.
Now, I struggled with this a bit when reading the source. Wait, God opposes the proud. Opposes is a very active, almost aggressive word.
It definitely is.
It paints a picture of the creator of the universe actively blocking a person's path. Does the sermon really suggest that God turns into our active opponent just because we have a bit of an ego? I mean, it almost sounds kind of petty.
I see why you'd say that for sure. And it raises a really critical question about the psychology of pride from a biblical perspective. The sermon notes clarify that God isn't being petty at all. He is actually responding to a jurisdictional threat.
A jurisdictional threat.
Yeah. The original text for opposes means that God sets himself in battle array against the proud person. He actively stands against them the way a military force would stand against an invading army.
Wow. So he's not just rolling his eyes at our arrogance. He is literally drawing a line in the sand.
He is. And to understand why the reaction is so severe, we have to look at how the source defines biblical pride. In our modern culture, we tend to think of pride as just like bragging about a promotion or thinking you're the smartest person in the room.
Yeah, just having your big head.
Right. But Brother Armstrong defines biblical pride as something much deeper. Self-sufficiency instead of God dependence. It is trusting yourself rather than trusting God.
Man, that definition of pride, self-sufficiency, is wild to think about. Because in our culture, self-sufficiency is the ultimate celebrated goal.
Oh, totally. It's the American dream.
We are taught from childhood to be independent, to rely on no one, to pull ourselves up by our bootstraps and build our own empires. We relentlessly celebrate the self-made person.
We celebrate it all the time, but within the spiritual framework of this text, that exact self-reliance is basically spiritual suicide. Yeah, because when you operate in complete self-sufficiency, Armstrong argues you are essentially telling God, I don't need you. I am fully capable of running my own universe, or at least my little corner of it, entirely on my own.
You're trying to do his job.
Exactly. You are declaring yourself the ultimate authority of your own life. You are stepping onto his throne. So God's active resistance setting himself in battle array isn't about him being insecure or easily offended. It's a necessary response to protect reality.
Protect reality. I like that.
He opposes the proud to prevent them from the ultimate destruction that comes from trying to operate a human life entirely disconnected from its actual power source.
So if operating in self-reliance turns God into a literal opponent blocking our way, the only logical solution, if a person wants to survive, let alone thrive, is to completely change their internal operating system.
Yeah, a complete reboot.
And the text follows the warning immediately with the cure, but gives grace to the humble.
That right there is the pivot point of the entire theology presented here.
But just like pride, humility is a word carrying a ton of cultural baggage today.
Definitely.
People hear the word humility, and they instantly think of someone who is deeply insecure, constantly putting themselves down, playing the martyr, or just acting like a doormat.
Yeah, like you have to hate yourself to be humble.
Right. But looking closely at Brother Armstrong's notes, I realized it's not about self-deprecation at all. Think about a master painter. Humility isn't that painter walking around telling everyone their art is garbage and they have zero talent.
Right, because that's just a lie.
Exactly, it's fake.
Mm.
True humility is the painter simply acknowledging that they didn't invent the concept of color. They didn't create the canvas out of nothing, and the very hands they used to hold the brush were given to them by someone else.
That's a great way to put it.
It's acknowledging the original source of the talent, rather than claiming they generated it out of thin air.
That analogy captures the essence of the sermon perfectly. Brother Armstrong explicitly states that humility is absolutely not self-hatred or having low self-esteem.
Thank goodness.
Instead, it is a heart posture that recognizes two fundamental realities at the exact same time. God is everything, and I am dependent on him. It is simply having an accurate, reality-based view of who God is and who you are.
It's just choosing to live in actual reality instead of a self-made delusion.
Exactly. And when a person steps into that reality, the dynamic changes instantly. The sermon references a story from the Gospel of Luke, chapter 18, to illustrate the mechanics of this. It's the story of the Pharisee and the tax collector praying in the temple.
Let's dig into that, because the contrast there is so sharp. You have the Pharisee, who is this highly respected religious expert,
Right.
and he's standing there essentially giving God a performance review of his own life.
Yeah, he's basically reading his resume out loud.
Right. He's listing his accomplishments, talking about how he fasts twice a week and pays tithes, and basically presenting a monument to his own self-sufficiency.
His entire posture says, "Look at what I have built. I don't need grace. I've already earned my standing." And because his cup is completely full of himself, there is literally no room for grace to be poured in.
It just spills over the side.
Exactly. But then you have the tax collector, who is viewed as a corrupt traitor by society. He stands far off. He won't even lift his eyes up to heaven, and he just beats his chest saying, "God, be merciful to me, a sinner."
He presents entirely empty hands. He brings no resume at all.
None. He's fully acknowledging his total lack of self-sufficiency.
And according to the text, Jesus says it was the tax collector, the one who lowered himself and admitted reality, who went home justified, not the religious expert.
Yeah, and the principle Armstrong extracts from this is vital. Grace is not a wage you can earn. You cannot work for it or buy it with good behavior, but humility actually positions you to receive it.
It opens the valve to that dispersant we talked about earlier.
Exactly. Grace, like water, always flows to the lowest point.
So if humility is the internal realization that we aren't the creator of the universe, how does that internal mindset translate to external action?
That's the million-dollar question.
Right, because it's easy to say, I'm dependent on God in the quiet of your own mind, but what does that practically look like when the pressure is actually on? Does the sermon outline a physical practice for this?
It does, and it uses a word that people might struggle with even more.
Yeah, the text in verse 7 answers that with a word that might be even more controversial than humility. It says, submit yourselves, therefore, to God. And I have to be honest, submit feels incredibly toxic in our modern context.
It carries a really heavy connotation of being dominated or crushed by someone else.
Right. It sounds like losing an MMA fight and tapping out, or waving a white flag and being conquered by an enemy. How does Brother Armstrong reconcile this call to submission with the entire stated goal of the sermon, which is learning how to stand strong?
Well, if we connect this to the bigger picture, the key is really in the transition word James uses. Notice that verse 7 starts with therefore.
Yeah.
Therefore, submit.
Okay, so it links back.
Exactly. That word conceptually links the external action of submission directly back to the internal posture of humility we just discussed in verse 6. Submission, in this biblical framework, is simply the physical outworking of internal humility. It means intentionally placing yourself under God's authority and yielding your will to His.
So it's less about being conquered by an enemy and more about voluntarily reporting to a supreme commander.
That's it. It's about taking your rightful place in the hierarchy of reality. The Greek word used for submit is hupotasso, which was originally a military term. It meant to arrange troop divisions in a military fashion under the command of a leader.
So it's about order.
It's entirely about order. And if we look at the ultimate example Brother Armstrong provides, it completely redefines submission from weakness to supreme strength. The notes point to Jesus himself in the Garden of Gethsemane, recorded in Luke 22.42.
Right before his execution.
Yes, I mean, he is facing unimaginable physical and spiritual horror, and his human instinct is naturally to avoid the pain. But he prays, not my will, but yours be done. That is the perfect mechanical model of biblical submission. He didn't tap out to an enemy. He aligned his human will with the Father's ultimate infinite plan.
It changes the whole perspective on it.
It's like aligning the tires on a car. If the tires are fighting each other, the car is going to shake itself apart at high speeds. But when the tires are submitted to the steering column, when they are in alignment, the car can handle immense speed and pressure. Armstrong argues that submission isn't about being crushed. It is about clicking into your designed alignment with the power of the universe.
And when you click into that alignment, that is when you finally gain access to real power. Here's where it gets really interesting, because the second half of James 4.7 delivers the payoff for this entire process, and it's a massive promise. Resist the devil, and he will flee from you.
It's an incredible guarantee, but the sequence of the verse is absolutely non-negotiable.
The sequence is everything. You cannot jump to part B without completing part A.
Right, you can't just skip the submission part.
Exactly. When I was thinking about how this mechanism of authority works, I pictured a military chain of command. Imagine a low-ranking private standing on a battlefield. That private, on his own, has zero personal authority or physical strength to order an enemy general to retreat.
Not at all.
If that private just stands up and yells, "Run away,"
Yeah.
the enemy general is going to laugh and probably run him over. But if that private is holding a radio and he is relaying a direct authorized order from the supreme commander of the Allied forces, suddenly that enemy general has to run.
Oh, I love that imagery.
Right. The private didn't go to the gym and get physically stronger. The power didn't come from his own muscles or his own resume. The power and the terror strikes in the enemy comes entirely from the authority of the one he's reporting to through that radio.
That analogy perfectly illustrates the core thesis of Brother Armstrong's message. Spiritual authority over external forces or internal temptations does not come from your own willpower, your intellect, or your spiritual track record. It flows exclusively from your active submission to God.
You have to be holding the radio.
Exactly. The sermon makes it very clear. You cannot effectively resist the devil if you haven't submitted to God first. If you try to fight your spiritual battles in your own strength, relying on your own self-sufficiency, you are essentially a private yelling at a tank without a radio.
Just making a bunch of noise.
Just making noise. You are disconnected from command, and the enemy knows you have absolutely no backing.
So how does this look in practice?
Well, to show how this works, the notes reference Matthew 4, where Jesus is tempted in the wilderness. How did Christ resist Satan in that moment? He didn't just flex his divine muscles or engage in a debate of personal willpower. He repeatedly submitted to the authority of the scripture, saying, "It is written."
He relied entirely on what the Father had already spoken.
Yes. The overarching theme Armstrong draws from this is that spiritual warfare isn't just about swinging a sword at the darkness or trying really hard to be a good person. The actual battle, the only fight that truly matters, starts and ends in the silent, hidden posture of your own heart submitting its will to God.
So the external battle you are facing is actually won or lost before you even engage the enemy. It is determined entirely by who you are bowing to in private.
The premise is that the devil must flee, not because of how strong you are, but because he simply cannot stand against the God you are submitted to. God desires a relationship of fellowship and dependence with humanity, not our stubborn self-sufficiency.
Right.
Humility restores that fellowship, submission aligns us with his will, and from that aligned relationship flows the undeniable authority to conquer whatever is standing against you.
So what does this all mean for you as you listen to this? When we look back over the architecture of Brother Armstrong's sermon notes, it really reads like a law of spiritual physics.
Yeah.
Let's trace the equation one more time.
Okay, let's do it.
Number one, God possesses a superabundant, neutralizing supply of grace. Number two, God actively resists and blocks the proud who try to navigate life on their own self-sufficient terms. Number three, God pours that neutralizing grace out on the humble who admit their desperate need for reality. Number four, that internal reality check of humility naturally leads to the external action of submission, where we align our fragile will with God's infinite authority. And finally, number five, that authorized alignment is what produces actual, unshakable spiritual victory.
It is a complete sequential roadmap. And to bring this from abstract theology into reality, the sermon notes conclude with a very direct personal application. Brother Armstrong asks his listeners to look in the mirror and answer a few deeply uncomfortable questions.
All hard stuff.
Yeah. Are you actually depending on God right now, or are you secretly depending on your own intellect, your own bank account, or your own willpower? Is there an area of stubborn pride in your life that is literally causing God to set himself in battle array against you, blocking the very grace you are desperate for?
Wow.
Have you truly submitted your will to his, or are you still fighting for control of the steering wheel? The challenge of this text is absolutely unavoidable. Humble yourself to access the grace, submit your life to God's command, and only from that posture will you be equipped to walk in victory.
It is the ultimate paradox. The way to stand up to the crushing weight of the world is to stop trying to hold it up yourself. We started this deep dive talking about the aggressive posture we usually take when we face challenges. Bracing ourselves, standing tall, fighting in our own limited strength.
Which just wears us out.
Exactly. According to the framework of this sermon, that is the fastest route to defeat. So I want to leave you with this final thought to carry with you today. If you are feeling completely exhausted and overwhelmed by a battle in your life right now, is it possible you're exhausted because you've been trying to fight it on your feet? What if the only way to actually win the standoff you're facing tomorrow is to intentionally start your morning on your knees?